Have you ever wondered why the ones you gave the most to always seemed to need more? They never asked if you had enough. They only praised how much you could give. And when you were exhausted, they called you strong. When you were silent, they called you mature. When you stopped asking for anything, they said you were so easy to love. But the truth is colder than that. They never admired your selflessness. They depended on it. They dressed your erasure in the language of virtue, told you your value was in sacrifice, told you you were good because you never made them uncomfortable, because you never said no, because you gave and gave and gave, while they took guilt-free. They taught you to be selfless, not because it was noble, but because it made their selfishness easier to carry. And the moment you stop playing that role, they won't call you kind anymore. They'll call you difficult, ungrateful, changed. But you haven't changed. You've just remembered that you exist. They didn't need to silence you with cruelty. They did it with applause. They praised your calm when you swallowed your truth. They called you mature for letting others interrupt you. They used words like kind, generous, such a giver, as if those traits were blessings and not burdens. Every time you put someone else first, they rewarded you. Every time you apologized for feeling too much, they admired your control. And when you broke under the weight of constant giving, they called you strong, because it meant they didn't have to change. You learned early that to be loved, you had to become useful. You had to adapt. So you shrank. You made yourself easy to be around. You cleaned up messes you didn't make. You said yes before anyone asked. You held other people's pain in your body like it was your fault they were bleeding, and the more you disappeared, the more they smiled. You thought that meant you were safe, but you weren't safe. You were digestible. You were easy to manage. You were loved conditionally, and the condition was your silence. They taught you that love looks like service, that care means convenience, that to be good is to disappear without protest. So you performed. You buried your needs under politeness. You ignored your intuition to keep the room calm. You mistook emotional labor for connection, and no one corrected you, because your pain kept others comfortable. You were told that selflessness was noble, that giving without limits made you worthy. But all it did was empty you. You smiled through discomfort. You rationalized disrespect. You stayed in rooms where your presence was valued only when you didn't take up space. And when you tried to set boundaries, they called you selfish. They said you'd changed. They blamed your growth for the tension they'd ignored for years. But this isn't about change. It's about clarity. You're not colder now. You're clearer. And what you see, finally, is the truth they worked so hard to hide. They needed you to be selfless, so they could be selfish. They needed your guilt to keep their image clean. They needed your over-functioning to excuse their under-functioning. And you, raised to be accommodating, carried the weight for everyone and called it love. As psychoanalyst Alice Miller wrote in The Drama of the Gifted Child, many people suffer all their lives from this oppressive need to be good as defined by others. That's what they gave you, a definition of good that required you to abandon yourself. They didn't teach you how to feel. They taught you how to suppress. They didn't teach you how to love. They taught you how to please. And now that you've begun to unlearn the script, they call you rebellious. But you're not rebelling. You're remembering who you were before obedience was mistaken for kindness. You're not cruel. You're no longer available for emotional theft. Because goodness that costs your soul is not goodness. It's programming, and you're done being programmed. You've traded performance for presence. And even if they miss the version of you that said yes too often, you don't. You grieve her, the girl who thought that being loved meant being erased. But you don't bring her back, not for comfort, not for approval, not for anyone. Because now you know, if love asks you to vanish, it's not love, it's consumption. In the next section, we'll explore how they weaponized your empathy and why guilt became the leash you wore like a necklace. They never needed to raise their voice to control you. They only had to look hurt. A sigh, a pause, a subtle withdrawal of warmth. And you rushed in to close the gap. Not because they asked you to, but because you were trained to. You learned early that love is earned through emotional labor. That being good means being attuned. That your job is to feel everything for everyone, except yourself. You weren't taught empathy. You were taught hyper-responsibility, a survival instinct disguised as compassion. You became the mirror, the sponge, the emotional interpreter. You predicted moods before they arrived. You apologized before blame was assigned. You forgave things that had no apology, and they praised you for it. They said you were so caring, so emotionally mature, so giving. But they never stopped to ask what it cost you. They never noticed how quickly you collapsed inside, how your nervous system remained on high alert, always listening, always adjusting. You became the one they vented to, leaned on, fell apart around. You were the safe place, but no one asked where you went when you needed safety, because you never showed it, you never said it, you never even let it rise in you fully. You shut your needs down in the name of love, and they let you, every single time. The worst kind of manipulation is the one that hides inside admiration. They loved your empathy, but only when it meant you'd stay soft while they stayed careless. Only when it meant you'd prioritize their wounds over your own healing. You were expected to understand everyone, to forgive everything, to offer kindness where you received silence. But what you never noticed, or maybe you did, is that their comfort always came first. The moment you asked for reciprocity, the moment your feelings got too loud, suddenly the dynamic shifted. You were no longer the nurturing one. You were sensitive, reactive, too much. And they didn't have to say it with words. They said it with distance, with avoidance, with labels like intense or emotional. And just like that, your empathy became a liability. But here's the truth. It was never empathy they valued. It was your self-abandonment, your emotional availability, your silence in the face of their damage. You weren't chosen for your heart. You were chosen for your compliance. And every time you sensed that something was off, every time you hesitated, pulled back, wanted to ask for more, guilt flooded your system like an alarm. That wasn't conscience. That was programming. You were never allowed to need as much as you gave. So when you finally reached your edge, you didn't feel entitled to protection. You felt ashamed. As therapist Terence Real writes in I Don't Want to Talk About It, people who grow up caring for others' emotions often develop what looks like empathy, but it's really codependency dressed in compassion. That's the part they never warned you about, that your goodness could be used against you, that your capacity to care could become the very thing that chains you to the wrong people. You weren't just helping. You were trying to earn love, earn safety, earn belonging, and now you see it. The pattern. The praise that only lasted when you stayed in your place. The way they needed you to feel everything so they could feel nothing. And you thought this made you strong, but it made you a host. And now that you're withdrawing, now that your eyes are sharper and your answers are shorter, they call you distant, cold. But you are not cold. You are clean. You're learning to feel without absorbing, to witness without carrying, to love without dissolving. And if you feel guilt rising now, let it surface, let it pass. That's just the old system panicking. That's just the old wound reacting to the silence it can't control. And if you've made it this far, you're already halfway free, because the moment you name it, it loses power. The moment you stop calling it empathy and start calling it what it is, emotional servitude, something shifts. You stop performing, you start choosing, you start coming home. And in the next section, you'll see what happens when guilt no longer whispers, "You're wrong," but you begin whispering back, "Not anymore." They stopped controlling you the moment you took over the job. That's the genius of subtle manipulation. It teaches you to monitor yourself. You became the one who swallowed your voice before anyone could silence it. You felt guilt before anyone had time to disapprove. Your mouth rehearsed justifications before your truth was even spoken. At some point, you stopped needing their cues. You built an entire internal system designed to keep you obedient. Your nervous system didn't just respond to danger, it responded to disappointment, even imagined disappointment. You learned to read their moods like survival maps, navigating their comfort before they even opened their mouth. And when you made a decision that prioritized yourself, a no, a delay, a confrontation, your body punished you. Tight chest, racing thoughts, emotional nausea. Because you weren't raised to ask, what do I need? You were trained to ask, what will they think of me if I do this? Self-neglect became the contract you signed to stay acceptable. And when you tried to cancel it, the guilt came knocking, wearing your own face. They didn't have to remove your agency. You did it for them, not out of weakness, out of programming. You learned to fear the consequences of your truth more than the damage of your silence. You weren't just managing relationships. You were managing your own mind. You silenced anger with rationalizations. You turned boundary violations into misunderstandings. You buried your resentment so deep it started speaking in fatigue. Your needs didn't disappear. They just changed shape. They came out as anxiety, as people-pleasing, as chronic overthinking. And when others didn't reciprocate, when they ghosted, gaslit, minimized, you didn't get angry. You got apologetic. You searched yourself for what you did wrong. Not because you were naive, but because your body still believed that guilt was safer than rejection. That if you felt bad enough, you might be loved again. But that equation was a lie. Dr. Janina Fisher, expert in trauma and author of Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors, writes, "The traumatized mind will often choose shame over rage, because shame keeps us attached. Rage threatens to sever the bond. And that's what they conditioned you for, to never sever, to stay loyal even when you were breaking, to feel ashamed of your clarity. They planted a guilt that activated every time you tried to choose yourself. And now, even in moments of freedom, you feel it, that tremor, that second guessing, as if saving yourself is still something to apologize for. But now comes the reckoning. Because guilt is no longer a sign that you're wrong. It's a sign that you're waking up. You're not selfish. You're not cruel. You're someone who's finally refusing to bleed to keep the illusion alive. And yes, it will feel unnatural, wrong even, because you were taught that silence is strength, that stillness is dignity, that swallowing pain makes you lovable. But now, you're choosing something radical, truth, even if it shakes, even if it costs you their approval, even if your voice trembles when you say no more. And if your body resists, let it. That's not failure, that's residue. That's the echo of a system breaking down. And here's what you must understand. They may never acknowledge what they did. They may never validate what they erased. But your nervous system doesn't need their permission to heal. It only needs your consistency, your refusal to abandon yourself again. So let the guilt come, let it scream, and then let it pass. Because something far quieter is rising beneath it, your integrity, your sovereignty, your calm. And once that becomes your center, they won't recognize you anymore. Not because you became someone else, but because you're no longer someone they can manage. Next, you'll understand why your stillness unsettles them, and why your refusal to explain is the most radical thing you've ever done. They used to celebrate your silence, but not the kind you carry now. Back then, your silence was submission, a soft exit from conflict, a quiet agreement to keep their comfort intact. You didn't speak because you were afraid of the ripple. You didn't explain your pain because you knew they wouldn't stay to hear it. You silenced yourself to preserve proximity, and they rewarded you. They called you easy to be around. They said you were grounded. They praised how you never made drama. But it wasn't peace. It was obedience. You muted your truth so they wouldn't call you difficult. You smiled so they wouldn't flinch. And when it hurt, you turned that pain inward. You made it your flaw. You thought, if I were less sensitive, this wouldn't feel so bad. But now, the silence is different. It's no longer you vanishing. It's you withholding. You're still quiet, but not to avoid rejection. You're quiet because you finally know who deserves your voice. You don't rush to reply. You don't chase discomfort. You don't decorate your boundaries with soft words just to be digestible. You say less, and they notice. Because your silence now doesn't beg to be liked. It demands to be respected. And here's what they don't know how to handle. Your stillness no longer seeks harmony. It creates distance, not out of pettiness, but out of protection. You're no longer available for those who only show up when they need softness to collapse into. And that terrifies them, because now your silence reflects back everything they refuse to see. It shows them the impact of their absence, their neglect, their emotional entitlement. You don't yell, you don't plead, you don't prove. You simply step back, and suddenly they have no more script to control you with. Psychiatrist Judith Herman in Trauma and Recovery wrote, "The conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. But sometimes the proclamation isn't loud, it isn't a confrontation. Sometimes it's a withdrawal, a quiet severing. You don't burn bridges, you stop lighting the path back to you. And in that calm refusal to engage, they see the truth. The version of you that served them is gone. Not with a scream, with a pause, with a boundary. And that's where your real power begins. When your absence starts to speak louder than all the explaining you used to do. If you feel the urge to justify yourself right now, pause. That urge isn't your wisdom, it's your training. The reflex to over-explain is a residue of a time when love was earned through emotional transparency. But not everyone deserves your reasons. Not everyone has earned access to your inner world. Sometimes healing looks like answering with silence, not to punish, but to protect what you've spent years rebuilding. And if a part of you feels guilty for the space you've taken, breathe. That guilt is just the old system gasping for relevance. Let it dissolve. You're not being distant, you're being deliberate. And if you're reading this thinking, this is exactly where I am, then this is your quiet confirmation. You're not wrong for being hard to reach. You're healing, you're filtering, you're no longer available for dynamics that thrive on your availability. And no, not everyone will understand that. They'll call it arrogance, bitterness, coldness. Let them. Your worth was never meant to be public opinion. Some truths only need to be felt by the one who carries them. So let them feel your absence. Let them sit in the silence they once used to ignore your presence. Because when you stop filling the space, they finally notice how much of it was yours. The next shift begins when your presence is no longer something they assume, but something they must now earn. They never expected you to disappear quietly. They expected resistance, a little pushback, a tearful reaction, something they could manage, contain, soothe, and then reset. What they didn't anticipate was your stillness, the abrupt absence of justification, the sudden silence not born from fear, but from finality. You stopped answering their questions, not because you had nothing to say, but because you finally understood that some conversations are just rehearsals for pain. They used to know how to pull you back, ask for understanding, play confusion, accuse you of overreacting, and there you were again, explaining your feelings to people who had no intention of changing. But now you don't flinch, you don't beg, you don't soften your no, you don't present your wounds for inspection, you let the silence sit. Let the discomfort grow. You let them wonder. Because you've realized that the more they misunderstand you, the more power you hold. They can't decode you anymore. And that scares them more than your past vulnerability ever did. You've become the version of yourself they can't predict. And nothing unsettles those who once used your empathy like your indifference. You're not cold, you're unreadable. And to those who relied on your emotional transparency, that feels like betrayal. They were used to seeing through you, watching the fear in your eyes, the tremble in your voice, the hesitation before you spoke your needs. They knew how to steer you with shame, how to poke at your doubt, how to keep you in place by reminding you how much you owe. But something has changed. You don't explain your decisions. You don't offer disclaimers. You say, "I'm done," and mean it. Not in rage, in clarity. And the absence of chaos in your exit confuses them more than 1,000 confrontations ever could. Psychologist and relationship expert Esther Perel once said in The State of Affairs, "The quality of our relationships is determined by the quality of the boundaries within them." And that's what you've rebuilt, not walls, but boundaries so clear they no longer require defense. You don't perform your pain. You don't overexpose your process. You let the consequences speak for themselves. And quietly, you've become the one they now fear to offend. Not because you're dangerous, but because you're gone the moment disrespect enters the room. You don't raise your voice. You vanish. You don't demand accountability. You make absence your answer. And they are left with questions they once forced you to carry. There's a strange kind of peace that rises when you stop asking for permission to be respected. It's not loud. It's not proud. It's still, sharp, final. You've learned that not everyone deserves access to your evolution, that the version of you who used to plead for validation is buried under the one who now moves in silence. And here's the irony. They only called you too emotional when they thought they could handle your reactions. Now that there are none, they call you cold. But cold is just what warmth looks like with boundaries. It's what love becomes when it no longer tolerates disrespect. If you're here, reading this, and you've reached the moment where you no longer want to be understood by those who chose to misunderstand you, let this be your quiet confirmation. You're not broken. You're becoming unreadable to those who only loved the version of you they could manage. And if they're uncomfortable now, it's because the rules have changed. You no longer explain your absence. You no longer soften your exit. You simply stop offering your energy where it's mishandled. And in doing so, you become unforgettable. Not because you screamed, but because you didn't need to. In the next part, you'll see why your silence didn't just protect your peace. It became a mirror they could no longer look into. They don't say your name with confidence anymore. They hesitate, just slightly. They don't know who you are now, because you no longer show up the way you used to. They feel the difference in your pauses, in the way you answer slowly or not at all. You used to rush in to soothe discomfort, to explain your mood, to reassure them that nothing had changed. But now, you offer no such comfort. Your stillness has become unfamiliar. They reach for the buttons they once used to control you. Guilt, urgency, nostalgia, but nothing responds. You are no longer wired to their patterns. You are not angry. You are unavailable. And that confuses them more than anything. Not your absence, but your neutrality. You are not punishing them. You are simply not there. And they can't name what they've lost, because they never understood what they had. You weren't just kind. You were loyal beyond reason. You weren't just patient. You absorbed the blame they refused to carry. Now that you've stopped, they feel it. Not because you left with rage, but because you left with nothing to prove. They always expected a version of you that folded, that gave the benefit of the doubt, that returned after reflection with softened eyes and gentler words. But that version is no longer available. The one who stayed up overthinking, second-guessing, trying to decode their coldness. She's resting now. The one who used to walk into rooms full of apology. He's silent now. There's nothing left to chase, no validation to seek. You've crossed into a space they cannot reach, not because you've become superior, but because you've stopped negotiating your self-worth. As Dr. Gabor Maté writes in When the Body Says No, when we have been prevented from learning how to say no, our bodies may end up saying it for us. That was your old life. Your boundaries were only heard when they collapsed into illness, when your exhaustion became physical, when your resentment bled into your nervous system. But now, you say no before your body has to scream. You don't explain it. You don't soften it. You just leave what harms you. And in that departure, you've become someone they never expected. Not wounded, but unreachable. This is not indifference, it's discernment. The sacred space between knowing your worth and no longer trying to convince anyone of it. You're not hiding, you're protecting. You're not cold, you're calibrated. Your presence now requires depth, safety, reciprocity. And most people aren't used to earning access to someone they once took for granted. So they'll call you distant, aloof, different. Let them. You no longer rush to correct their narrative. You no longer bleed in public to prove you still feel. The ones who truly see you now are the ones who respect your distance, not resent it. They speak softly. They ask with intention. They don't touch what hasn't been offered. And that's how you know. You've outgrown the people who mistook your availability for obligation. You don't need to reclaim your old softness. You never lost it. You just stopped handing it to those who mishandled it. Now your kindness has a backbone. Your love has edges, and your silence is no longer an invitation to decode. It's a mirror, a clear reflection of the line you drew in the sand, not to push people away, but to see who would respect the threshold. In the next section, you'll understand why their story about you no longer matters. Because you're finally living outside the version of you they invented. They once wrote your role for you. The helper, the forgiver, the understanding one. You wore that mask so well, they started believing it was your face. And for a while, so did you. You became fluent in shrinking. You mastered self-erasure. You edited your needs down to fragments just to fit the version of you they could love. You let them narrate who you were, always so kind, so mature, so easy to talk to. But none of those words described you. They described what you did for them. You weren't seen. You were interpreted, reduced, projected onto. And slowly, you disappeared beneath the weight of their comfort. Until one day, something broke. Quietly. A moment, a look, a final request dressed in manipulation. And you didn't respond the way you used to. You didn't reach. You didn't explain. You didn't perform. You watched it pass. And in that moment, something irreversible happened. You stepped out of their story. Not with bitterness, not with rage, just clarity. You saw the page, you saw the pen, and you realized it was never yours. They will rewrite the ending. They will say you changed, that you became distant, hard, ungrateful. They'll twist the silence you left behind into arrogance. They'll hand each other versions of you stitched from fragments of the past, the ones where you still bled on cue, and you will not correct them. Because you no longer exist to be understood through their lens. You no longer tether your peace to whether they remember you kindly. You're not bitter, you're free. As Dr. Bessel van der Kolk writes in The Body Keeps the Score, once you start approaching your body with curiosity rather than with fear, everything shifts. And that's what you've done, not just with your body, but your history. You no longer fear what happened. You no longer fear the memories they refuse to validate. You hold them like facts, like stones, like silent witnesses. And because you've stopped needing them to acknowledge the pain finally let go of you. You didn't heal because they apologized. You healed because you stopped needing them to. Now, you move like someone who remembers who they were before they were reshaped. You don't explain your glow. You don't apologize for your distance. You don't fill in the blanks of their unfinished sentences. You let them talk. You let them guess. And you live, fully, quietly, without the need to narrate your recovery. You no longer need to be seen to feel real. You've outgrown their version of you. And more importantly, you've stopped trying to fix it. Some stories are not yours to rewrite, only to walk away from. And if they ask where you went, you won't answer. Because the truth is, you're not gone. You're just finally home. Not in their arms, not in their understanding, but in your own presence. And nothing is more radical than that. And if you felt this shift inside you, if this silence, this distance, this quiet boundary feels like home, then don't keep it to yourself. Let it be echoed. Let it be heard. Somewhere, someone else is still apologizing for breathing. So share this. Leave it where someone who needs it might find it. And if these words felt like yours, stay close. Subscribe. Quietly. Like it not for me, but for the version of you that finally stopped shrinking.